Hi everyone. Today's video is about what I think is a really important topic, and that's the topic of trying to minimize food waste. I had the chance to chat with someone, interview someone for my Optimistic Future podcast, someone from a group called the Leftovers Foundation. Her name's Julia Kramer, and the Leftovers Foundation is based out of Alberta, which is one of the provinces in Canada for folks who are not Canadian listening to this video. And they do a lot of really great work. They're a not-for-profit organization. I think they might be a registered charity. I don't remember off the top of my head. But basically, they go around and they coordinate. They have a bunch of volunteers, and they basically coordinate pickups from bakeries and grocery stores and food co-ops and places like that. And basically, food that is still very much fit for human consumption. It's just maybe not pretty enough to be sold, by the store standards or whatnot. It's day-old bread or something like that. They pick up that food and then they bring it to homeless shelters and other places of that nature, so that folks can consume that food instead of that food, going into the compost or, heaven forbid, going into the garbage, which is going to fill up the landfills and cause other problems. And composting that perfectly good food also not a good thing. So they're doing really amazing work, and really inspiring. And I recommend, if you're in that region of Canada, consider supporting them. Either through donating some funds, donating your time, and there are other groups like that, to my understanding, in other parts of Canada and other parts of the world. And so definitely worth looking at that. With the whole premise behind the Optimistic Future podcast is to distill it down, though, into simple steps that we can all take to help with a given issue. So not all of us have the extra disposable income to donate to a group like that, or maybe we're already donating to other groups, and so we're like, you can only donate to so many people, or maybe folks listening, don't have the time to, volunteer for a group like that. And fair enough. But what are some of the simple steps that we can all take to actually make a difference around the topic of food waste? Why is food waste even a problem in the first place? Please check out the podcast interview to get a more detailed answer to that question. But kind of the bullet points, to my understanding, are that food waste is a problem. Just ethically, when there's places in the world, places in our communities where people have so much food that they're like throwing it out, or not managing those resources well enough, so that perfectly good food, spoils and gets thrown out, or maybe it's perfectly good food and it gets thrown out anyways. That's just ethically really unfortunate. It's really just not okay when there are people in the world that are, not able to, in our own communities, who don't have enough food to sustain themselves and their families and whatnot. So just from an ethical perspective, I think it behooves us, who are fortunate enough to have access to food, and especially have access to an excess of food, to really try to be good stewards of that food and not let it go to waste just for ethical reasons. But over and above that, and things happen, no one's perfect. It's like, oh darn, we bought too much turkey and we didn't eat it in time and it's gone bad. It happens. In my household, we've been, me in particular, I'm quite Spartan about, we really don't waste any food. We're really careful and meticulous about that. But despite our best efforts, sometimes some food winds up in the compost. Things happen. But I think trying to do our very best to really kind of take it on ourselves as a responsibility to try to be good stewards of the food that we do have, I think for ethical reasons makes a lot of sense. It's also really important from an environmental perspective, and rationale behind that is that it takes quite a bit of energy and resources to make food. Whether it's growing vegetables, growing animals, what have you, it takes a lot of energy and resources. And whether that's the energy that's required for the fertilizer, or growing the animal feed, or get the electricity or other consumables that go into getting water to the fields if it's not raining enough, or whatever it happens to be, to say nothing of the environmental impact of driving the trucks and other vehicles or boats or whatnot that are actually shipping the food, whether it's from your local farm to the farmer's market where you're buying it, or it's shipping your bananas from South America to your grocery store and the northern reaches of North America. The food there's quite a significant environmental impact on the food that's created. And so if we're, as a collective society, if we're creating more food than we need, and a significant amount of that food is being thrown out, then that's something that's really wasting resources. It's essentially polluting the environment for no good reason. So from an ethical perspective, from an environmental perspective, I think those are really important reasons to minimize food waste. There's also, to my understanding, a financial component as well, an economic component, I should say, to trying to minimize food waste. If we're wasting food, it's like, well, who's going to pay for that? At the end of the day, it's the consumers that are paying for for that. If, you know, a large grocery store chain says like, oh, well, we threw out, you know, this many millions of tons of food this month, well, they're not saying, oh darn, we mismanaged our resources. We're gonna eat that. It's like, no, they're going to inflate the grocery prices that we're all paying for, and it's ultimately going to drive up food prices. So for several, I think, very good reasons, it's a good idea to minimize food waste. So what can we do to minimize our food waste? What can we do beyond, you know, donating to a group like the Leftovers Foundation, or volunteering our time for an analogous to that organization, or an analogous one? You know, what are the simple steps that we can take in our day-to-day lives? So as always, with any of my podcast episodes for the Optimistic Future podcast, if you go to the website, which is optimisticfuturepodcast.com, there is a tab and it just says simple steps, and you just click on that, and that's a summary of the simple steps that we can take around some of the different topics that have been talked about on the podcast. So you can always reference that. But some of the simple steps to minimize food waste, just to present them here, if you don't want to go check out the website, or you're listening to this while you're driving and can't go check it out, would be pretty straightforward stuff. You know, Julia from the Leftovers Foundation mentioned these, and hopefully I'm paraphrasing them well. One of the ways that we can minimize food waste is just being really conscientious with what we're actually buying at the store. You know, not going out and impulse buying groceries. You know, have a game plan for, you know, what do we need to buy, make a list ahead of time. It's simple, but that's one of the ways that we can try to minimize overbuying things. You know, if at the grocery store it's like, 2 for 1 for this, like, well, I wasn't planning to buy, you know, 5 pounds of asparagus. I only wanted 2 pounds, but I'll buy 5 pounds because it's a good deal. You know, maybe just take a second to think about, like, well, am I really going to go through that 5 pounds of asparagus? So just to try to be mindful with the groceries that we're actually purchasing. Another thing to consider that, if memory serves, Julia mentioned during our interview, is just remembering we can freeze things. So like, say you overbuy asparagus, and it's like, darn, I'm not going to get through this asparagus. I don't think in a couple of days it's going to be no longer fit for human consumption. Well, you could, you know, parboil that and chuck it in the freezer, or, you know, cook up the chicken breast that's, you know, maybe going to go off, and you know, put that in the freezer. Or I know in our household, there's a wonderful store that we get you know, free range meats from and things like that. And you know, when I'm going through the packs of meat, it's like, oh, they clearly somebody missed one, or you know, one was you know, there's a bunch that's going to, you know, best before date's 2 weeks from now, but there's a couple of packages that were left over. It's like, oh, they're best before dates within a couple of days, and I think, well, you know, I'm going to cook meat within a couple of days. I'll just buy those. You know, I don't need to get the freshest ones. It's all going to taste just fine when it's cooked up. Or if I see like, oh, you know, these are for sale, if I don't buy them, like, who's going to? It's like, well, maybe I'll purchase them and then I'll chuck them in the freezer, and then I'll thaw them before I'm ready to eat them. So we can take a little bit more stewardship just as a whole of like, well, okay, the store has this food here. Maybe even though it's maybe not the most convenient thing in the world, maybe sometimes I can purchase something that it's not the prettiest apple, or it's you know, the meat that's only got a couple of days before the best before date. You know, maybe I can still work that into my schedule, and it's just going to prevent food waste. So these are some of the things that we can consider. Another simple step on that topic of best before dates is that it's important to note that best before dates are not something that are how can I put this? They're best before dates are not the hard and fast truth in terms of when a food is definitely going to be bad. It is best before. To my understanding, it's something that's determined relatively arbitrarily. You know, we should always use our best judgment. If there's, you know, a canned good or something like that, it's past the best before date. We open it up and it's, you know, moldy and gross. It's like, well, don't want to eat that. There's always like the sniff test, the look test. You know, how does this stuff look and smell? But if, say, for example, there's you know, we bought more cereal than we were going to go through, or overbought, say, cereal, for example. It's like, oh, my child needs more, you know, organic cornflakes, because one of my kids loves organic cornflakes, and it's like, oh, the best before date was from 3 months ago. It's like, well, I'm gonna open that up. It looks fine, it tastes fine, it's all good. So bearing in mind that best before dates are not 100% entirely arbitrary, but we can also apply some good common sense and really try to minimize that food waste. So again, the episode was part of the Optimistic Future podcast. You can check that out on any major podcast platform. I have the full interview on our YouTube channel of the same name. And yeah, please consider doing what you can to minimize food waste. And I hope this video was of interest.